Talking about the peripheral nervous system, it comprises of the nerves which originate from the brain and the spinal cord, and we are going to consider the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves in this section. Now, because we are talking about the peripheral nervous system, first of all, the bunch of the neurons that would be carrying out the conduction function of the impulses, that would be termed as nerves. Now, from which part they are originating, that name would be given to those nerves. Now, supposedly the nerves are originating from the brain, because you know that there are two parts in the central nervous system. One is brain and other is the spinal cord. So, let us for a reference purpose use the term cranium for brain over here. So, the nerves that originate from the cranium itself, they would be termed as cranial nerves and would be part of peripheral nervous system, and the nerves which originate from the spinal cord, they would be referred as spinal nerves. So, we are having two types of nerves that are present in the peripheral nervous system. We are not considering whether they are innervating the autonomic nervous system or they are innervating the involuntary, that is the somatic nervous system, that is in the control of our own sense. So, we are talking about the cranial nerves. Talking about cranial nerves, they would originate from the brain. Now, the different parts of the brain, you are very well aware of them by now. So, we have the forebrain, we have the central brain. So, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves out of 10 which arise from the brain stem itself. So, 2 of them, they arise from the central brain and forebrain basically, and the remaining 10, they arise from the brain stem. Now, what we are more concerned about is that what is the basic nature of these nerves. So, when we talk about basic nature of the nervous system, we are referring to whether they bring the signal towards the processing unit or they take away the signal from there, that is they take away the information from the processing unit. So, we have two types, one is sensory and the other one of the cranial nerves would be mixed. Mixed nerves would be having both motor and sensory neurons present inside it, whereas in the sensory nerves, that is sensory cranial nerves, there would be sensory neurons which would be present. Okay. Now, when we talk about the mixed nerves, mixed cranial nerves, in that also the neurons which are present, they are predominantly efferent, they are predominantly motor in nature. That means they are more concerned with taking the information from the brain towards the sense organ. Okay, so sense organ whichever is involved in it, whether the skin or the eyes or other of the organs of the body. So, we have the two types. Now, these cranial nerves, they are given the numbers in Roman numerals depending on anterior to posterior. Supposedly something is arising, the first one would be arising from the forebrain, then we come to the brain stem, 2, 3, such Roman numerals are the designations which are used for these cranial nerves, and we have 1 and 2 which originate from the central brain and they are sensory in function. The third and fourth, they originate from the midbrain. Then we have fifth to eighth, they originate from the pons varoli of the brain section, and from the 9th to 12th, that originate from the side of medulla. So, you see that this part is the brain stem from which the 10 of cranial nerves are arising, and this is what is to be understood about cranial nerves. In brief introduction, we talk about these 12 cranial nerves in detail, which parts they innervate in the next section. Before that, we have to understand about spinal nerves, and for that we have to understand spinal nerves very briefly. Now, what is there in spinal nerves? As the name suggests, they would be the nerves which originate from the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and that naming is basically done in terms of the thoracic vertebrae, not thoracic vertebrae, sorry, the vertebral column. We have the division of vertebral column and the vertebrae are given the name accordingly. So is the name for the spinal nerves which originate from the specific vertebrae. So we have 8 spinal nerves which are known as cervical because they are associated with cervical vertebrae. Then we have 12 spinal nerves known as thoracic. Then we have 5 of them known as lumbar spinal nerves. Then we have 5 sacral and 1 is coccygeal. So, in this way we have 31 pairs over here. Okay. Now these 31 pairs, because both of the parts, because the central nervous system would give rise to two nerves which would go to both left and right side posterior ends and peripheral ends, not the posterior ends. Each spinal nerve joins the spinal cord at the 2 points which is known as roots. We have seen that in structure of spinal cord as well. Now we have a dorsal root ganglion and the anterior root which is present inside a spinal nerve. Now this dorsal root ganglion, it is a form of swelling which is present. Now when we talk about roots, we have to see that there would be an anterior root and there would be a posterior or the dorsal root. Now supposedly this is the spinal cord, it has something, a similar structure would be like this. Over here there would be a bunch of sensory neurons. This is the sensory root and this is the motor root. Now you have to remember that the anterior root is the motor root and motor neurons inside the grey matter. This is the motor root basically. This is anterior root inside the grey matter of the spinal cord, that is present, anterior root. This would be a spinal nerve basically. The afferent and efferent neurons both would comprise a spinal nerve. These two are not two different spinal nerves. These two are a single nerve, that is one part is going here over here and the part of the pair, the other part would be going to the other side of the body. So over here we have this dorsal root ganglion. Now what is this dorsal root ganglion? Before the sensory neurons they enter the grey matter, they form a bunch that is swelling in the middle of dorsal root, that root which innervates the spinal cord at the point. Those are the neurons. It innervates the spinal cord in the white matter and it contains a bunch of sensory neurons and that is known as dorsal root ganglion. The motor part, the lower side, has the anterior root which is having the motor neurons and there is no anterior root. There is dorsal root ganglion and there is no anterior ganglion basically. There is no ventral ganglion also there. So basically we have only one ganglion and one root that is present inside the spinal nerves, and apart from that what is to be learnt is that there are 31 pairs which are present, and how they are named? They are named according to the vertebrae from which they arise. So this is all about the peripheral nervous system, basically not the peripheral nervous system in detail because we have not considered the somatic and involuntary systems over here. We have to talk about autonomic nervous system as well, but for now we have limited our scope of knowledge towards to the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves that arise from the central nervous system and become the part of peripheral nervous system.